You have planned the perfect date. You have sent the thoughtful message, timed just right, worded just right, careful not to seem too much yet warm enough to prove you care. You have shown up early, remembered the small details, offered patience through their silence, extended grace through their inconsistency, and still, somehow, none of it landed the way you hoped. If this sounds painfully familiar, I need you to hear something that might initially feel uncomfortable but will ultimately set you free. Effort was never the currency that mattered here. Something else entirely determines whether someone with avoidant patterns leans in or pulls away, and today we are going to name exactly what that something is. Let's start by dismantling a belief that quietly ruins countless relationships involving avoidant partners. The belief that sufficient effort eventually produces sufficient security. This belief makes intuitive sense on the surface. Most healthy relationships do respond reasonably well to genuine effort, consistent care met with consistent reciprocity, kindness met with growing trust. But avoidant psychology operates according to a different internal logic entirely, one where effort, especially visible, insistent effort, can actually trigger the exact opposite of what it intends to produce. Rather than generating safety, concentrated effort often generates pressure, and pressure, to a nervous system wired around avoiding engulfment, registers as threat rather than as care. Let's talk about what actually does matter, because naming it clearly changes everything about how you might choose to show up going forward. What avoidant individuals respond to, far more than effort, is the felt sense of autonomy remaining fully intact within the relationship. This means feeling that closeness does not come attached to obligation, that affection does not arrive with strings, that their own independence, their own pace, their own capacity to retreat and return without punishment or interrogation remains genuinely protected. This single factor, the preservation of autonomy, influences avoidant comfort and avoidant willingness to lean in considerably more than any amount of grand gesture or considerate planning ever could. Let's talk about why autonomy matters so disproportionately within this particular psychological architecture, because understanding the origin clarifies why no amount of effort can substitute for it. Avoidant patterns typically develop through early experiences where closeness felt inseparable from control, where love came wrapped in expectation, where emotional connection required surrendering some genuine piece of independent selfhood in exchange for approval or acceptance. This early wiring creates a lasting equation. Closeness equals loss of self. Effort, however well-intentioned, often inadvertently reinforces this exact equation, because effort frequently arrives bundled with implicit expectation, the unspoken hope that this effort will be reciprocated, noticed, rewarded with increased closeness in return. Let's talk about the specific difference between effort that respects autonomy and effort that inadvertently threatens it, because this distinction deserves considerable unpacking. Effort that respects autonomy tends to be offered without attached expectation, freely given, easily received or declined without consequence. It communicates, implicitly, that your care exists independent of their response to it, that your own well-being does not hinge on whether this particular gesture produces the desired reaction. Effort that threatens autonomy, by contrast, often carries an unspoken transaction, an implicit sense that this gesture requires acknowledgement, requires reciprocity, requires a particular response in order to feel worthwhile. Let's talk about how this transactional quality gets detected, often unconsciously, by avoidant partners, because this detection happens considerably faster and considerably more automatically than most people realize. Avoidant individuals typically developed, through necessity, a heightened sensitivity to relational demand, an almost instinctive radar for detecting when closeness is about to require something of them. This radar activates regardless of how kindly or how generously an expectation gets framed, meaning even beautifully executed effort, if it carries genuine underlying need for reciprocity, tends to trigger withdrawal considerably more reliably than more neutral, low-pressure interaction ever would. Let's talk about what genuine, low-pressure interaction actually looks like in practice, because this deserves concrete description rather than remaining purely theoretical. It looks like offering warmth without monitoring closely for its reception. It looks like extending an invitation once, clearly, without repeated follow-up designed to secure a response. It looks like sharing your own life, your own interests, your own experiences, without requiring equivalent disclosure in return before feeling safe to continue. It looks like maintaining your own full life, your own friendships, your own goals, such that your emotional well being genuinely does not depend on their particular response in any given moment. Let's talk about why this particular quality, low pressure presence rather than concentrated effort, tends to produce genuine safety within avoidant psychology considerably more reliably than any amount of demonstrated care ever could. Safety for an avoidant nervous system comes primarily from predictability paired with freedom, knowing that closeness will remain available without requiring active management or active performance in order to sustain it. Concentrated effort, however generous, often inadvertently signals the opposite, suggesting that the relationship requires continuous active maintenance, that closeness is precarious enough to require constant reinforcement in order to remain intact. Let's talk about the specific psychological experience many people report once they shift from concentrated effort toward this quieter, lower pressure presence, a shift that often surprises them considerably, given how counterintuitive it initially feels. Reducing visible effort, particularly effort previously deployed anxiously in an attempt to secure connection, frequently produces, somewhat paradoxically, increased interest and increased engagement from the avoidant partner. This occurs precisely because reduced anxious effort removes the pressure that previously activated their defensive withdrawal, allowing genuine curiosity and genuine attraction, rather than defensive retreat, room to develop naturally. Let's talk about what this shift does not mean, because clarity here protects against a common and understandable misinterpretation. This does not mean abandoning genuine care or genuine investment entirely, becoming coldly detached in an attempt to manufacture interest through strategic withholding. Manufactured detachment, performed specifically to produce a desired reaction, carries its own detectable quality, often registering as manipulation rather than genuine security. The goal here is not performed indifference. It is authentic redistribution of your own emotional investment, genuine engagement with your own separate life, such that your presence within the relationship comes from genuine fullness rather than from anxious need. Let's talk about validation. Worth stating plainly here, because this entire reframe can initially feel like painful confirmation that your genuine care was somehow wasted or unwelcome. Your effort was never wasted in the sense of reflecting anything wrong with your character or your capacity for love. It simply operated according to an assumption, reasonable within most relationships, that does not hold true within the specific psychological architecture avoidant patterns create. Understanding this does not diminish the genuine value of your care. It simply redirects how that care might be most effectively expressed going forward, whether within this relationship or within future ones requiring similar understanding. Let's talk about what happens specifically when autonomy remains genuinely protected within a relationship over considerable time, because this protection, sustained consistently, often produces exactly the kind of gradual opening that concentrated effort alone rarely achieves. Feeling genuinely free to retreat without punishment often paradoxically reduces the actual need to retreat as frequently. Feeling genuinely unmonitored in their emotional responses often increases willingness to share those responses more openly. This gradual opening develops slowly through repeated experience of genuine safety, rather than through any single gesture, however well-intentioned that gesture might be. Let's talk about the specific role patience plays throughout this entire process. Patience considerably different from the anxious waiting that concentrated effort typically produces. This patience involves genuine trust that autonomy protected consistently will eventually produce its own natural movement toward greater closeness, without requiring active pushing or active management on your part in order to accelerate that movement. This patience does not guarantee any particular outcome, but it does create considerably more favorable conditions for genuine closeness to develop than concentrated effort, however well-meaning, typically manages to produce on its own. Let's talk about what boundaries look like within this framework, because protecting autonomy for someone else does not mean sacrificing your own needs entirely in the process. Genuine boundaries remain essential, communicating clearly what you require in order to feel secure within the relationship, while simultaneously respecting their need for genuine independence and genuine pace. This balance, protecting your own needs while respecting their autonomy, represents considerably more sophisticated navigation than either extreme, either demanding effort insistently or abandoning your own needs entirely in an attempt to avoid appearing demanding. Let's talk about a specific mistake worth examining directly: the assumption that increasing effort in response to their withdrawal represents the logical, caring response, when in reality, it frequently accelerates the exact retreat it was meant to prevent. This mistake feels intuitive, precisely because it works reasonably well within most other relationship dynamics, where increased care during moments of distance genuinely helps repair connection. Within avoidant psychology specifically, increased effort deployed during withdrawal often reads as increased pressure, arriving at precisely the moment their nervous system already feels overwhelmed, compounding rather than relieving the very discomfort driving their retreat in the first place. Let's talk about what a genuinely different response to their withdrawal might look like. A response considerably more aligned with what actually supports eventual reconnection. Rather than increasing contact or increasing visible concern the moment distance appears, allowing that distance to exist without immediate intervention often serves considerably better. This does not mean ignoring genuinely concerning patterns or abandoning reasonable communication about your own needs. It means resisting the reflexive urge to chase closeness the moment it feels threatened, trusting instead that genuine space, offered without anxiety attached to it, tends to resolve more naturally than space aggressively pursued or aggressively questioned. Let's talk about the specific internal work this requires from you. Work considerably more demanding than simply learning a new behavioral strategy to apply mechanically. Withholding anxious pursuit during moments of their withdrawal requires you to tolerate your own discomfort with uncertainty, your own fear that distance might become permanent, your own urge to seek immediate reassurance through increased contact. This tolerance develops gradually through practicing genuine self-soothing rather than relying on their reassurance to regulate your own anxiety, a practice that ultimately serves your own psychological development, considerably beyond whatever it might eventually contribute to this particular relationship's trajectory. Let's talk about what genuine self-soothing actually looks like during these difficult moments of uncertainty, because this deserves concrete description rather than remaining abstract. It might involve deliberately redirecting attention toward activities that provide genuine satisfaction, independent of the relationship. Physical movement, creative projects, time with supportive friends who offer connection without the complexity currently present within this particular dynamic. It might involve consciously naming your own anxiety honestly, acknowledging its presence without immediately acting on the urge it produces toward anxious contact or anxious monitoring. Let's talk about why this entire framework, prioritizing autonomy over effort, feels so counterintuitive to so many people navigating relationships with avoidant partners, particularly people whose own natural inclination leans toward demonstrating care through active, visible gesture. Many people learned through their own formative experiences that love gets proven through effort, through visible sacrifice, through consistent demonstration of care that leaves no doubt regarding its sincerity. This learned association makes the shift toward quieter, lower pressure presence feel almost like withholding love, rather than what it actually represents: a genuinely different, often more effective way of communicating that same care within this specific psychological context. Let's talk about what happens specifically to your own sense of identity throughout this process of learning to prioritize autonomy over concentrated effort, an identity shift worth acknowledging directly. Many people discover through this process that their own tendency toward intensive effort within relationships actually reflected their own anxiety more than it reflected genuine, secure care. A realization that extends valuable insight well beyond this single relationship into how you might approach connection more broadly moving forward. This insight, Uncomfortable as it initially feels, often produces considerable long-term benefit, protecting you from repeating similarly anxious patterns within future relationships, regardless of whether those future partners carry avoidant patterns themselves. Let's talk about what genuine trust in this entire process actually requires. Trust that autonomy, protected consistently, without anxious monitoring for its results, will eventually produce movement worth having, or alternatively, will reveal clearly that this particular relationship simply is not capable of developing the closeness you genuinely deserve. Both outcomes represent valuable information, and both outcomes become accessible only once concentrated, anxious effort gets released in favor of this quieter, more patient approach. An approach that ultimately protects your own well being, regardless of which specific direction the relationship eventually takes. Let's talk, finally, about what remains true throughout this entire reframe, regardless of whether it ultimately produces the specific relational outcome you might be hoping for. Learning to offer care without attached expectation, learning to protect your own emotional stability independent of someone else's response, learning to trust patience over anxious pursuit. These represent genuine psychological growth, valuable entirely on their own terms, extending their benefit into every future relationship and every future circumstance requiring similar emotional maturity and similar self-respect. Let's talk about a specific scenario worth examining directly. What happens when reduced anxious effort genuinely produces increased engagement from them, tempting you to interpret this as confirmation that withholding effort functions as a clever strategy for producing desire? This interpretation deserves careful scrutiny, because treating reduced effort as manipulation, deployed strategically to trigger their interest, ultimately undermines the very authenticity that made the shift effective in the first place. The goal was never strategic withholding designed to produce a calculated reaction. It was genuine redistribution of your emotional energy toward your own fulfilling life, energy that happened, as a natural consequence, to reduce the pressure previously triggering that withdrawal. Let's talk about how to maintain this distinction clearly within your own mind throughout the ongoing relationship, distinguishing authentic redirection from calculated strategy, even as both might produce similar external behavior. Authentic redirection remains genuinely satisfying, regardless of whether it produces any particular response from them. Calculated strategy, by contrast, tends to feel hollow or frustrating whenever it fails to produce the hoped-for reaction, revealing that the underlying motivation remained fixated on their response, rather than genuinely invested in your own independent well-being throughout the entire process. Let's talk about what genuine respect for their autonomy specifically requires from you during moments when you genuinely disagree with a decision they have made or a boundary they have expressed. Respecting autonomy does not mean abandoning your own perspective or your own honest reaction entirely. It means expressing that reaction once, clearly, without repeated pressure designed to change their mind. Then genuinely allowing their decision to stand, even when it disappoints you personally. This distinction between honest expression and repeated pressure represents an important nuance within this entire framework, protecting your own voice while still genuinely honoring their independent decision-making capacity. Let's talk about what happens specifically to trust within a relationship where autonomy has been consistently protected over considerable time. Trust that tends to develop through a particular mechanism worth naming directly. Each instance where independence gets genuinely honored without punishment or guilt attached provides evidence, accumulating gradually, that this particular relationship differs from earlier experiences where closeness required surrendering genuine autonomy. This accumulated evidence, built slowly through repeated experience rather than through any single reassuring conversation, represents the genuine foundation upon which lasting security within avoidant psychology actually gets constructed. Let's talk about what specific patience this entire process requires from you. Patience considerably longer than most people initially anticipate when first learning to prioritize autonomy over concentrated effort. Genuine shifts in deeply ingrained attachment patterns typically develop slowly, often across many months, sometimes longer, meaning consistent protection of autonomy, deserves to be maintained considerably longer than initial encouraging signals might suggest is necessary before declaring the approach successful or unsuccessful. Let's talk about what remains available to you specifically once you have genuinely internalized this entire framework, moving beyond simply understanding it intellectually toward actually embodying it consistently within your daily behavior and daily emotional experience. What remains available is considerably reduced anxiety throughout the relationship overall, since your own well-being no longer depends entirely on producing a particular reaction through effort or through gesture. What remains available is genuine curiosity about how the relationship naturally unfolds, rather than anxious management of its every development. And what remains available, perhaps most significantly, is a version of yourself considerably more grounded, considerably less exhausted, and considerably more capable of genuine intimacy, whether within this specific relationship or within whatever connection ultimately proves capable of matching the genuine care you have to offer. Let's talk about the specific way this understanding applies not only to romantic partnership, but to every close relationship you might navigate with someone carrying significant avoidant patterns, friendships, family relationships, even certain professional dynamics, where genuine connection matters considerably. The underlying principle remains consistent across these varied contexts. Autonomy protected consistently tends to produce considerably more genuine closeness over time than concentrated effort or concentrated pursuit, regardless of the specific nature or context of the relationship in question. Let's talk about what happens when you apply this understanding, but still witness no meaningful movement toward greater closeness despite considerable, patient time having passed. This outcome deserves honest acknowledgement rather than continued indefinite patience extended without any corresponding evidence of genuine growth. Protecting autonomy creates favorable conditions for closeness to develop, but it does not guarantee that development will occur, particularly if deeper, unaddressed wounds remain entirely unexamined on their end. Recognizing when patient protection of autonomy has not produced meaningful evidence of growth over a genuinely reasonable timeline represents equally important wisdom alongside everything else discussed throughout this entire conversation. Let's talk about what it means to hold this entire framework with genuine flexibility rather than rigid, mechanical application. Adjusting your approach based on the specific texture of your own particular relationship rather than applying these principles uniformly regardless of individual circumstance. Every relationship carries its own specific history, its own specific patterns, its own specific balance between how much space genuinely serves growth and how much direct communication genuinely proves necessary alongside that space. Trusting your own accumulated observation of your specific situation, informed by this broader framework but never entirely governed by it mechanically, represents the genuinely wise application of everything discussed throughout this entire conversation. Let's talk, one final time, about the deeper truth this entire reframe ultimately reveals, a truth extending well beyond simply understanding avoidant psychology more accurately. Genuine love, in any relationship, secure or avoidant, healthy or complicated, was never meant to be proven primarily through effort or through visible sacrifice. It was always meant to be expressed through respect, through genuine care for the other person's autonomy and genuine well-being, offered freely rather than transactionally, sustained through patience rather than through anxious pursuit. This truth, once genuinely understood and embodied, serves you considerably well regardless of whether this specific relationship ultimately develops into the connection you have been hoping for, because it represents genuine wisdom about love itself. Wisdom that will continue guiding you toward healthier, more sustainable connection throughout every relationship you navigate for the rest of your life. Let's talk about the specific way gratitude toward your own growth deserves acknowledgement throughout this entire process, regardless of whatever outcome ultimately develops within this particular relationship. Learning to distinguish authentic presence from anxious performance, learning to protect your own emotional stability independent of someone else's response, learning to trust patience over desperate pursuit represent genuine accomplishments worth celebrating on their own terms. This growth belongs entirely to you, earned through considerable reflection and considerable practice, and it remains permanently yours, regardless of how this specific situation ultimately resolves, or however long that resolution takes to fully reveal itself. Let's talk about what it means to extend the same compassion toward yourself throughout this learning process that you have likely extended generously toward them throughout the relationship's entire history. Shifting away from anxious, concentrated effort rarely happens perfectly or immediately. There will likely be moments where old patterns resurface, where anxious pursuit temporarily returns despite your genuine understanding of why quieter presence serves considerably better. These moments do not represent failure. They represent the normal, non-linear texture of genuine behavioral change, deserving patience and self-compassion rather than harsh self-criticism whenever old habits briefly reassert themselves during this ongoing process of learning something genuinely new. Let's talk about the specific relief many people describe once this entire shift has genuinely settled into their daily experience. Relief that often surprises them, given how much they initially feared that reducing effort might somehow signal reduced care or reduced investment. This relief develops because concentrated, anxious effort, however well intentioned, proves genuinely exhausting to sustain indefinitely, requiring constant vigilance, constant monitoring, constant management of both your own emotional state and theirs. Releasing this exhausting labor in favor of genuine, patient presence typically produces considerable improvement in your own daily quality of life, entirely apart from whatever eventual effect it has on the relationship's overall trajectory. Let's talk, finally, about what it means to trust that genuine, sustainable love rarely requires the exhausting performance so many people mistake for necessary devotion. Real care can exist quietly, patiently, without constant proving, without constant anxious effort designed to secure its own validation. Trusting this quieter form of care, extending it consistently while protecting both your own boundaries and their genuine autonomy, represents the healthiest, most sustainable foundation available for whatever this particular relationship ultimately becomes. Let's talk about what it means to carry this understanding into every conversation moving forward, not as a rigid rule to be applied mechanically, but as genuine wisdom informing how you naturally show up, offering warmth freely, respecting independence fully, and trusting that whatever unfolds from this genuine, grounded presence represents considerably more reliable evidence of the relationship's true potential than anything concentrated effort could ever have revealed on its own. This is not about doing less because you care less. It is about finally understanding what genuinely reaches someone whose nervous system learned, long before you arrived, to equate closeness with danger, and choosing, deliberately, to offer exactly that instead. And so, if you have spent considerable energy pouring effort into a relationship that never seemed to respond proportionally to that effort, I want you to release the belief that more effort would have eventually solved this dynamic. What matters here was never effort itself. It was and remains the preservation of genuine autonomy, genuine freedom from pressure, genuine space to approach closeness at their own pace rather than yours. Redirect your energy toward building a life so genuinely full that your presence within any relationship comes from abundance rather than anxious need. And trust that this shift, quieter and considerably less exhausting than concentrated effort ever was, offers the healthiest possible conditions for whatever genuine connection eventually has the chance to develop.